Okay, so far we've been talking about the theoretical model in terms of the twin deficits. Now let's talk a little bit more about the empirical evidence of those twin deficits and see the hypothesis that is most likely to explain it. So we have this twin deficits hypothesis that, as we said before, budget deficits lead to current account deficits. And the reason why this is the case is if you look at the equation for the current account, where the current account is savings minus investment, as we know from before, and investment here is constant, it's zero, it's fixed, when savings is the combination of government and private savings, where government savings again is just the difference between the revenues and the expenditure. Notice that the current account is going to go into a deficit if investment is fixed, private savings are not affected, and the government goes into a deficit. So it relies on the government deficit, that's fine, but it relies on savings not changing. This was the whole idea of the Ricardian equivalent. So the idea here is that if you cut taxes or increase government spending and your government goes into a deficit, as long as investment and private savings do not change, the twin deficit hypothesis is going to be true. So that's the crucial assumption here, that investment and private savings are not affected by changes in government deficit, which in fact they might be the case. So let's have a look at the history of those deficits and see if we have other periods than the 1980s where the US current account budget deficit led to a current account deficit. So in the 1980s, this is the period we've been talking about so far. President Reagan's tax cuts and increase in the military spending led to those deficits. This is figure 14.4 on the top left. The evidence is right here. So the black line is the government savings. So notice that in the 80s it's going into a deficit, and this is the current account deficit as well. We see the twin deficits, the current account is diving at the same time. So the clear evidence of these twin deficits is in the 1980s with the Reagan tax cut. Now, look at President Obama's stimulus in 2007 in the top right. Now, the deficit went up by 8 percentage points, so a bigger increase in government spending because of the financial crisis. So this is the decrease in the government savings here, the black line. But notice that the current account actually improved a little bit. In other words, in this case, we don't really have evidence for the twin deficits. The current account improved by about 2.5 percentage points, whereas the government deficit decreased. So in the Obama era, we don't have the twin deficits phenomenon. Now, let's look at World War II as well. Deficit went up by 12% in order to finance the war. So this is the top left here. Notice that you have a big increase in the deficit. Notice that the current account went down as well, but not by as much. In other words, you have a much smaller drop in the current account. So you have the same direction, you have the twin deficits, but the magnitudes are not quite the same, right? The deficit of the government in the Second World War is much bigger than the dip in the current account. And then we have the period in the 1990s with the President Clinton, it's the bottom right, where the government savings actually improved. Notice that President Clinton improved the deficit. It went up from 6% deficit to a 2% positive, so that's an improvement of 7 or 8 percentage point. And look at what's happening at the current account. It's actually decreasing. In other words, you have no current account is actually going down. There is no twin deficits. In other words, with Clinton and Obama, we don't have such a big evidence. With World War II and Reagan, we do have some evidence. To sum up that evidence, well, it's a mixed evidence. Sometimes you do have twin deficits, sometimes you don't. The evidence for those twin deficits is actually quite mixed, and this is illustrated again in those 4 different episodes from the US history of both current account and government deficits. Now, the absence of evidence or strong evidence for that twin deficit is not evidence of absence. In other words, just because you don't see it in the real world doesn't mean it's not actually there. There might be a lot of other things going on at the same time, even if that hypothesis is true, to show up in the mixed evidence that we've seen. In other words, that is not disproving the hypothesis of the twin deficits. And what's going to do to see if we have supporting evidence for that hypothesis is going to be the implications about the twin deficits, about other macroeconomic variables, and how it performs when you put it to the data. So again, we're going to have those two views, the global savings glut hypothesis and the made in the USA hypothesis in figure 14.5 and 14.6, in which case it says, well, view 1, the global savings glut, says that US current account deficits that we're trying to tie down to a budget deficit is actually due to foreign factors. We've seen this before. So this is the global savings glut, says the US current account deficit is due to foreign factors and not to domestic ones. View 2 says the opposite. It says the US current account deficits going from positive to negative is due to domestic factors. In other words, an increase in investment or lower savings. US factors are causing this deterioration. And notice that those views are giving us the same testable implications we had before. Interest rates should be decreasing if we had the foreign factors. Interest rates should be increasing if we had domestic factors causing it, so that we can look at the evidence about real interest rate and see whether it's increasing or decreasing and decide which one of those two views is responsible for that. So the evidence again of the real interest rate is in figure 14.7, and we can see that starting at the beginning of the 1980s, the interest rate was actually increasing, which lends support to view 2. In other words, that domestic factors are responsible for the deterioration in the US current account in the 1980s. So either or an increase in savings, an increase in investment, or decrease in the savings, which could be part of the government savings. So this is what we see here, very high increase in the interest rate running up to the beginning of the 1980s. So we conclude that it was view 2, which is domestic factors, a decrease in savings or increase in investment, or both, that were causing these twin deficits, these current account deficits that we observe, because we can distinguish between the two views with the evidence of higher interest rates. So that view 2, that we see evidence on the interest rate, which is the made in the USA, is some combination between a higher investment in the US. So far we've assumed that investment was 0, but that's not the case, and a decrease in savings, which part of this could be due to government deficits. And notice that the sum of those government and private savings, as we know, is the total savings. So the decrease in total savings that could be responsible for this could be either private savings or government savings that were decreasing. And we have, so this is 14.8, picture 14.8, how shifts in an increase in the savings schedule, an increase in the investment schedule or a decrease in the savings schedule could lead, at the world interest rate of R star, the increase in the deficit. Of course, this is for a small open economy, and this is the difference between, so the solid black line is the private savings. Notice that how private savings in the beginning of the 1980s, especially in 84, started to deteriorate. Then you have private investment is the solid line with the dot on it, which started to increase. So notice how here you have a decrease in savings and increase in investment, which is exactly what would cause this deficit. Now notice that the dashed line here is the national savings. So the national savings has started to decrease. This is 1978. Notice how it's decreasing and even more. So we have some evidence of view 2 where national savings is decreasing, right? And investment, private investment, is also increasing in order to generate this domestic view 2 of made in the USA current account deficits. Okay, now relating the private to the national savings. So we see here that the national savings are actually decreasing, right? But notice that the private savings and the national savings, the difference between the dashed line and the solid line, are starting to diverge in this case. So you have that the national savings is much smaller than private savings. So from here on, the dashed line, which is national savings, starts to deteriorate. The private savings, it's still kind of constant and then deteriorates, but the point is they diverge, and the difference, of course, is the government savings deterioration. So that's evidence that this difference between the private savings and the national savings, which is the government savings, is deteriorating, and that's also causing the current account deficit. So that view 2 relates the US government budget deficit to the current account deficits that we have seen before. So they have started to diverge, which are due to the Reagan deficits that we've seen before. So those deficits, budget deficits, Reagan budget deficits, coincide with the current account deficit that we've seen, but that doesn't mean that, of course, that they are the cause, necessarily the cause for it. Because that's going to assume that private savings and investment are constant, which is not necessarily the case. So private savings were relatively constant and then deteriorated. Investment also has changed. So the deficit can actually influence private savings. We've seen this, so that's not necessarily the case that the Reagan deficits, the twin deficits, the Reagan budget deficits are the cause for the current account deficit, so that the twin deficit hypothesis is true. Okay, so here we investigate a little bit more in detail the twin deficits, the different periods in which it happened, and we try to see how it was due to domestic factors, how investment spending in the US has increased, whereas government deficits have deteriorated. So we have a very high correlation between those deterioration of the government balances and deterioration of the current account. But of course, just because they coincide doesn't prove that one actually leads to the other. Okay, so let's quickly summarize this chapter. What we did here is we brought the government in order to be able to talk about fiscal policy, and in particular how fiscal deficits, which are part of fiscal policy, can be related or even causing the current account deficits that we observed, and we call this the twin deficits hypothesis. So in order for the twin deficit hypothesis to work, we introduced the Ricardian equivalence theorem, which said that the timing of taxes doesn't affect the national savings. So we said if you have a tax cut and the Ricardian equivalence is holding, that cannot by itself explain twin deficits, because that implies that the current account should not change by much. So we said we either are going to rely on something else than a tax cut, so we brought in government spending and the Ricardian equivalence to explain the twin deficits, or we said if you have a tax cut and the Ricardian equivalence fails, then we can have the twin deficits, a failure of the Ricardian equivalence. We introduced in 3 different ways, which was the borrowing constraints, the one-period live households, and the distortionary taxation. So the twin deficits phenomenon could be explained by either an increase in government spending and the Ricardian equivalence holding, or a tax cut and the Ricardian equivalence not holding because of 3 different things, or both. And then we looked at some evidence in terms of whether those twin deficits were responsible but were causing by foreign or domestic factors. We saw evidence of increasing interest rate in the 1980s, which lent support to view 2, which is that domestic factors, including higher government deficits, were responsible for the current account deficits. And we said that even if that's the case, just coinciding government deficits with current account deficit does not mean that the government deficits are causing the current account deficits. So we both seen some way in which the twin deficit hypothesis could be supported by our model and by the data in different periods, and we also saw how that simply coinciding with budget deficits and current account deficit does not mean that the fiscal deficits are causing the current account deficits. Okay, so this is ending up this segment and this chapter 14. This is the last chapter that we were going to cover. So this is the finishing the material for the final exam. Thank you very much for taking this course, and good luck on your exams.